What kind of childhood could turn suffering into normal life? Not the kind built around comfort. Not the kind protected from cold, hunger, boredom, or fear. But the kind many old Irish families knew for generations. A childhood lived in smoke-dark cottages, under leaking roofs, on wet earth floors, with the wind pushing through cracks in the walls and hardship waiting outside the door before the sun even came up. For many children in old Ireland, life did not begin with softness. It began with endurance. And that is what makes this story so powerful. Because when most people today imagine childhood, they think of safety, warmth, play, choice, and protection. But for many old Irish families, raising children was tied to one brutal fact above all else. Survival came first. Always. Before comfort. Before feelings. Before dreams. Before childhood itself. And yet, out of those impossible conditions, something extraordinary was formed. Not perfect people. Not unbroken people. But people of astonishing toughness. People who could carry grief without speaking it. People who could work through pain. People who knew loyalty, family duty, sacrifice, and endurance in a way the modern world often struggles to understand. To really understand old Irish family life, you have to strip away the romantic image. Forget the soft music, the green hills, the cozy myths. That is not where this story begins. It begins in the cold. Imagine a child waking before dawn in a tiny cottage. The room is dim. The air is damp. Smoke from the hearth hangs low. Several people may be sleeping in the same small space. Blankets are thin. Clothes are reused, repaired, and worn until they can barely hold together. The child is not waking up to leisure. The child is waking up because the day's work is already waiting. And that work does not care how young you are. That is one of the first shocks of old Irish childhood. In many homes, children were not treated as delicate beings to be endlessly sheltered. They were part of the household. And being part of the household meant being useful. A little girl might help mind younger children before she was old enough to understand the full weight of responsibility. A little boy might be sent out in bitter weather to carry water, watch animals, gather fuel, or help in the fields. Some children learned very early that if they did not help, the family suffered. If they were slow, someone else had to work harder. If they complained too much, life did not suddenly become easier. And that changes a person. Because when responsibility arrives before comfort, childhood becomes something very different. It becomes short. Serious. Heavy. But what makes this even more intense is the setting those children were raised in. The homes themselves were often harsh places to live. Many rural Irish families lived in small cottages that were overcrowded, damp, and vulnerable to the weather. In poor areas, space was tight, warmth was limited, and privacy was almost non-existent. Rain did not feel like a distant inconvenience. It felt like something that could enter your home, your clothes, your sleep, and your bones. Children grew up surrounded by discomfort so constant that it stopped feeling unusual. The cold was not an event. It was part of life. The mud was not a problem to fix. It was part of the road, part of the yard, part of the season, part of being alive. The smoke in the air, the smell of turf, the rough bedding, the darkness of winter evenings, the strain in the adults' faces, all of it formed the background of daily life. There was no easy escape from it. No switch to press. No machine to solve it. No warm, separate world reserved just for children. And because the home was hard, the child had to become harder. But the physical hardship was only one part of it. What truly shaped these children was the rhythm of labor. In old Irish families, work was not a special event. It was the center of life. The family survived because everyone contributed in whatever way they could. That meant children were drawn into useful roles long before modern society would consider it acceptable. A child might spend the day helping with turf, feeding animals, carrying bundles, gathering eggs, collecting sticks, cleaning, scrubbing, or rocking a baby while an exhausted mother handled 10 other burdens at once. In fishing communities, farming communities, and poor rural households, there was always something to be done. Always something to fetch, lift, watch, clean, repair, dry, stack, or carry. And here is what is so fascinating. These children were not only being burdened. They were also being shaped by usefulness. That is something modern people often miss. Yes, the work was hard. Yes, it could be unfair. Yes, it stole softness and play from early life. But it also gave many children something powerful very early on. A sense that they mattered. A sense that their effort counted. A sense that family was not just a word. It was work, sacrifice, and interdependence. You were not just living under one roof. You were helping hold that roof up. But what happens when people are working this hard and there is still not enough? That is where the story becomes even more painful. Because for many old Irish families, hunger was never far away. There were homes where food was simple, repetitive, and uncertain. Potatoes, milk when available, coarse bread, broth, whatever could be stretched, saved, shared, or grown. And when times became difficult, meals could shrink fast. Portions could thin. Worry could thicken. Parents had to make impossible choices silently, trying to stretch little into enough. A hungry child learns things quickly. A hungry child learns not to waste. A hungry child learns to notice the mood in a room when food is being divided. A hungry child learns that adults can smile and still be worried. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, a hungry child often learns not to ask for too much. That kind of upbringing leaves marks that last long after the meal is over. Even when life improves, the memory of scarcity can remain inside a family for generations. It can show up in habits, in silence, in the way food is treated with seriousness, in the fear of waste, in the instinct to save, store, preserve, and prepare for leaner days. And yet the children kept growing. Kept helping. Kept enduring. So what held these families together under so much pressure? In part, it was discipline. And this is where modern viewers may feel deeply conflicted. Because love in old Irish families was often real, but it was not always soft. It was not always spoken. It was not always wrapped in gentle reassurance. Parents were often carrying their own exhaustion, fear, grief, and pressure. Life had made them hard too. So affection was often expressed through labor, sacrifice, food shared, clothes mended, and endless effort rather than open emotional language. A mother might go without so her child could eat. A father might break his body with work and never once say the words modern people expect to hear. Care was there, but it could be hidden under severity. Children were expected to listen. To obey. To hold themselves together. To understand, without explanation, that life was serious. And that seriousness created a strange emotional world. Many children felt deeply protected by family and deeply pressured by it at the same time. They knew loyalty. They knew belonging. But they also knew fear of failure, fear of disobedience, fear of becoming an extra burden in a household that could barely carry its own weight. That tension is what makes old Irish family life so emotionally powerful to look back on. It was full of love, but not always the kind that looks warm from a modern distance. Sometimes it looked like sacrifice without tenderness. Sometimes it looked like silence instead of comfort. Sometimes it looked like endurance being mistaken for strength because there was no other option. And beyond the home, another force was raising these children too. Nature. The Irish landscape is beautiful, but beauty is not the same as ease. For children in old rural Ireland, weather was not scenery. It was a teacher. Cold rain, bitter wind, dark mornings, rough fields, slippery paths, boggy ground, long walking distances, and physical exposure shaped the body and the mind. These children learned quickly that the world was not built around their comfort. If it was raining, tasks still had to be done. If it was cold, animals still needed care. If the road was rough, you still walked it. If your hands hurt, there was still work to finish. Modern people often try to build resilience through speeches, books, courses, and inspirational slogans. Old Irish children often met it in mud. They learned balance on uneven ground, patience in bad weather, endurance through repetition. They learned that discomfort did not always mean danger. That exhaustion did not always mean you could stop. That fear could sit beside you while you kept moving. And that creates a toughness many people today can admire, but few would want to earn the same way. Still, if this story were only about labor, cold, hunger, and discipline, it would be unbearable. But that is not the whole truth. Because old Irish families also carried something else. Something invisible, but powerful. Story. Memory. Faith. Identity. Even in hard homes, there were voices around the fire. There were prayers said in darkness. There were warnings, songs, sayings, blessings, local legends, family histories, and old beliefs that wrapped suffering in meaning. Children were not only raised by their parents. They were raised by a cultural memory older than the house itself. They grew up hearing who they belonged to, whose blood they carried, what kind of people they came from, what had been survived before, what God saw, what the dead had endured, what the family must never forget. And in a life that could feel cruel, that mattered. Because hardship without meaning crushes people. Hardship with meaning can hold them together. A child who hears only pain becomes afraid. But a child who hears that pain is part of a larger story may begin to carry it differently. Not easily. Not happily. But with a sense that suffering is not random. That endurance is honorable. That family memory itself is a kind of shelter. That is one reason so many descendants of old Irish families still feel the emotional weight of the past even generations later. The toughness was passed down, yes. But so was the memory. So was the silence. So was the pride. So was the ache. And that brings us to the hardest truth of all. This kind of upbringing created strength. But it also came with a price. It made children capable. But sometimes too serious too soon. It made them resilient. But sometimes emotionally guarded. It taught duty. But sometimes at the cost of softness. It taught silence. But sometimes that silence buried pain that never found words. This is where the story becomes more than simple admiration. Because it is tempting to look back and say, they were stronger then. And in some ways, they were. But strength is not free. Some children grew into adults who could survive almost anything, but struggled to speak affection openly. Some learned how to work tirelessly, but not how to rest without guilt. Some knew how to sacrifice for family, but not how to speak about what hurt them. Some carried fear, grief, hunger, or shame deep into later life without ever naming it. So no, this is not a story about pretending the past was better. It is a story about understanding what it demanded. And maybe that is why it still grips people so deeply now. Because modern life has given many families things old Irish parents could hardly imagine. Warmth. Food variety. Medicine. Comfort. Privacy. Education. Safety. Convenience. Choice. But in gaining all of that, many people wonder if something else has faded. A sense of duty. A deeper bond between generations. The ability to endure discomfort without falling apart. The understanding that family is not just affection, but sacrifice. That question lingers because the contrast is so sharp. Old Irish families raised children in conditions most people today would call unbearable. Yet from those homes came people who built lives, crossed oceans, held families together, endured grief, worked through hardship, and carried a fierce sense of identity that still echoes now. Not because they had easy lives, but because they were trained by necessity to endure hard ones. And maybe that is the deepest lesson in all of this. The old Irish child was not raised to chase comfort. That child was raised to survive reality. Raised to notice the weather, the workload, the hunger in the room, the mood of the adults, the duty of the day. Raised to become useful early. Raised to understand that family was both refuge and responsibility. Raised inside conditions most people now would reject in a heartbeat. And yet somehow, from that world came extraordinary endurance. Not polished. Not glamorous. Not always gentle. But real. And behind so many old Irish family lines is the same quiet truth. Before there were stories of pride, migration, survival, and identity, there were children. Children who carried turf. Children who walked through rain. Children who slept in the cold. Children who learned silence. Children who grew strong because life gave them no softer choice. That is why this history matters. Because it reminds us that whole generations were shaped under pressure most people today can barely imagine. And whether we admire that, grieve it, or feel both at once, we should not forget it. They were not raised in comfort. They were raised in endurance. And maybe that is why their memory still feels so powerful now. If this story reminded you of your own parents, grandparents, or the old ways your family came from, share it in the comments. I want to know what kind of toughness was passed down in your family. And if you enjoy videos like this about old Irish families, forgotten traditions, ancestry, and the deeper realities that shaped the Irish people, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.